Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are strapping on our masks, grabbing our slapsticks, and diving into what is basically the foundational DNA of Western entertainment.
Yeah, Commedia Dell'arte.
Exactly. I mean, if you're looking for the origin story of like the sitcom, the character archetype, improv comedy,
Even the professional actress.
it all comes back to this 16th to 18th century Italian phenomenon known literally as the comedy of the profession.
And that phrase, of the profession, I mean, that's really the key, isn't it? Before Commedia, theater was mostly for amateurs or academics, maybe religious groups.
Right.
These actors, they were the first known full-time touring professional theater companies in Europe.
Right.
They literally created the blueprint for how a show could be structured, performed, and marketed.
So the mission for this deep dive is really to unpack that whole revolution. We've got sources that cover everything from, ancient Roman farces all the way up to Picasso's canvases.
And they all point back to this one theatrical form.
And what stands out immediately is just the genius of its structure. We're talking about something that completely exploded across Europe. I mean, they were traveling as far as Moscow.
Incredible.
And it was all powered by two seemingly contradictory innovations for the time.
Oh, completely contradictory. First, you have this fixed cast of archetypal characters.
The masked ones.
Often masked, yeah. The miser, the doctor, the clever servant, the hopeless lovers. Audiences knew them instantly. You didn't need any exposition. You knew who Harlequin was the second he walked on stage.
And then second, despite these fixed types, the performances were all about improvisation.
All improvisation, yeah.
Right.
Based on these structured scenarios. So this wasn't actors reading from a script. It was highly skilled, spontaneous storytelling.
And the other piece that makes Commedia so revolutionary,
Yeah.
the immediate acceptance of professional actresses.
A massive deal. These troupes were putting women on contracts, making them global stars, centuries before other Western theaters would really, catch up.
It must have been a huge societal shift.
Oh, it was. And it caused immense controversy, which, ironically, probably just fueled her popularity. Commedia dell'arte was entrepreneurial, it was scandalous, and it was utterly dominant.
So we're going to explore why these masked characters still kind of dictate the way we tell jokes and structure our stories today. Let's unpack this. Okay, so let's start at the very, very beginning and trace the roots of these iconic masked figures. When historians try to place Commedia dell'arte, they often look far, far back.
Straight back to antiquity, yeah, that's the tradition. Now, it's very difficult to prove a direct, unbroken link across, the Dark Ages and the early Renaissance.
Sure.
But the formal similarities, they're just too striking to ignore. Historians often draw these parallels between Commedia and the Atellan farces of the early Roman Republic.
I love the farces.
Yeah, these were ancient farces from the Italian town of Atella. And they relied heavily on crude, fixed, masked character types and improvised plots, all about country life.
So we're talking about characters like Pappus, the foolish old man.
Exactly. And Maccus, the gluttonous sort of stupid servant, and Manducus, who was this kind of fearful ogre type.
It feels like these are really primitive versions of the later Italian archetypes.
Precisely. The argument basically is that Pappus is the ancestor of the miserly old Venetian merchant, Pantalone.
Right.
Maccus, who was often paired with a cleverer slave, Buccus, they kind of merged over time and became the Neapolitan Pulcinella.
The tricky servant.
The tricky, often violent servant figure. And that Manducus type, the braggart soldier, well, that later solidifies into Il Capicano.
But wait a minute. I mean, tracing a direct link across 1,000 years feels a little bit like historical guesswork, right? Especially with the lack of documentation in between. Are historians really confident about this?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. It's why we have to treat the link as, let's say, a tradition of scholarship rather than an ironclad genealogy. Sure. Many historians lean toward the idea that specific local Italian traditions, they survived in folk performances or rural festivals. And they kept the spirit of this masked, improvised farce alive until it reemerged in the 16th century.
So it's less about a formal company surviving for 1,000 years.
Oh, much less. It's more about the idea of the archetypal mask just persisting in the kind of Italian cultural subconscious.
Fascinating. So fast forwarding to the 16th century, the sources clearly point to a dual tradition for how Commedia emerged, North and South.
Yes, and that geographical distinction is crucial. The northern tradition, that's centered around wealthy, sophisticated courts, places like Venice, Florence, Mantua. And this tradition is fundamentally tied to the conventions of Carnival in Venice.
Ah, carnival. Okay, that makes
I
sense.
mean, Carnival was already a time of masked revelry.
So the masking, which is so central to Commedia, was just adopted from this pre-existing carnival convention.
That's it, exactly. By 1570, sources confirm that the actor Andrea Calmo had created the character Il Magnifico, the Magnificent One.
The precursor to Pantalone.
He's the immediate precursor to Pantalone. Il Magnifico was, this stingy, often lecherous Venetian merchant. He and Pantalone are almost interchangeable in the early scenarios, which just shows how the theatrical mask was pulled directly from the societal mask of Carnival.
And then you have a sharp pivot to the south, a completely different atmosphere and a different central character.
Totally different. The Neapolitan tradition centered on Naples, which was, a very different cultural hub, much more focused on popular street life. And here, the key figure was Pulcinella.
Right.
And Pulcinella is distinct. He's often described as like half-witted, but also half-clever, a mix of a melancholic servant and an aggressive prankster, deeply associated with the food and the street life of Naples.
And Pulcinella, of course, becomes the ultimate traveler. He starts as this Neapolitan stock character.
But his influence eventually just completely dominates English puppet theater.
Punch and Judy.
That's probably his greatest legacy. Pulcinella traveled north, became Polichinelle in France, and then he crossed the English Channel to become Punch. The lineage is so direct. The physical traits, the hooked nose, the humped back, and that malicious anarchic spirit of Punch. You can trace it all straight back to the Neapolitan Pulcinella.
So you have the northern focus on the wealthy masters, like Pantalone.
And the southern focus on the chaotic servant, Pulcinella. And eventually they merge to form the full ensemble cast we recognize.
And this professional, masked outdoor theater was so revolutionary because it stood in direct opposition to the academic theater of the time.
It was the total opposite of commedia erudita, or learned comedy.
Learned comedy, right.
Yeah, erudita was academic. It was performed indoors by untrained, unmasked actors, usually young men studying at universities. I mean, think of it as high literature staged for the elite.
Whereas Commedia Dell'arte used professional, costumed, masked actors performing outdoors, usually on a temporary stage in a public square.
Right, a piazza or a court if they got an invitation. But the fundamental distinction was that professionalism, the commitment to the mask as a character identifier, and the reliance on the actor's physical skill, not the literary quality of a script. The name Comedy of the Profession really said it all. And that professionalism brings us right to the most progressive and scandalous innovation of commedia.
The women.
The emergence of women as professional, paid touring artists.
It's just astonishing when you think about the conservative environment of 16th century Europe. The logistics alone, having women travel across borders, perform, manage their own money, it must have just completely upended social expectation.
It did. The sources, they confirmed documentation of professional actresses as early as the 1560s. We even know the name of Lucrezia di Siena.
The first one known by name.
The first one we know of, yeah. She was signed to an actor's contract in 1564. And after her, you get these true stage celebrities emerging. Vincenzo Armani and Barbara Flaminia are recognized as the first genuine prima donnas. They commanded incredible respect and significant payment. I mean, unheard of for non-noble women at the time.
And having actresses on stage must have completely changed the dynamic of the performances. Suddenly the innamorati roles, the young lovers, they're much more believable.
Oh, absolutely. Before, men would play all the female roles, which, inherently limited the realism of any romantic conflict.
Sure.
With women on stage, the romantic duets gained this new authenticity. And the female characters, like the servetta, the maid, they became these powerful, witty manipulators instead of just simple caricatures. The actresses were crucial to the dramatic symmetry of the scenarios.
This success, it drew immediate and intense fire. The moral outrage, especially from the church, was severe.
It was a full-scale assault, and it crossed borders. English critics in the 1570s were already, denigrating the troops for having female actors.
Yeah.
Decades later, the playwright Ben Jonson famously hurled insults at a commedia performer. He called her a tumbling whore.
Wow.
The public association between being an actress and being a prostitute was swift, and it was brutal.
And in Italy, the church's opposition was actually codified. This went beyond just moral scolding.
Oh, they absolutely tried to systematically ban female performers. A scholar, Ferdinando Taviani, he synthesized church documents that reflect this opposition. The church saw the very presence of women on stage, traveling, earning their own money. They saw it as a corrupting force. Taviani actually coined the term negativa poetica, negative poetry, to describe the practices the church found so offensive.
Negative poetry. So what did that really encompass? What was so offensive beyond just having women on stage?
Well, it was multifaceted. The church's complaints, they went way beyond just scanty attire, though that was a big one. They objected to the very context of the performance. The mixing of sexes on and off stage, the potential for cross-dressing, and importantly, the overt satire of religious officials, which the masks made very easy.
Of course.
They view the actress as basically analogous to a courtesan, because her job involved public display, constant travel, and financial autonomy, all outside the typical patriarchal structure.
So the church was essentially weaponizing the perception of promiscuity to try and strip these women of their professional legitimacy. It was the independence that was seen as so dangerous.
That's the core of it. The prelates argue that the actress's lifestyle would, infuse young men with carnal desires and undermine public morality. The idea of a woman traveling independently, performing suggestive material, and commanding large sums of money was a direct challenge to the social order.
But despite all that resistance, they couldn't stop them.
No. The source material is very clear. By the end of the 16th century, actresses were an indispensable standard feature of the Italian professional stage. Their entrepreneurial spirit just won out over the religious censure.
And that controversy really transitions perfectly to the logistical challenges these troops faced. I mean, because they were constantly targeted by authorities, they couldn't settle down.
They couldn't. Their nomadic life was a necessity for survival. The company. They were incredibly sophisticated business structures. You look at Gelosi, the zealous ones, one of the most famous troops.
Led by Francesco and Isabella Andreni.
That's them. Their coat of arms was the two-faced Roman god Janus, symbolizing their constant movement and, their dual nature.
So what was the fixed structure of a company like that?
They had remarkable stability for traveling performers. The core group was usually the usual 10 performers. 4 innamorati, the 2 pairs of lovers, 2 vecchi, the old men Pantalone and Il Dottore, 2 zanni, like Harlequin and Brigella, a captain, and a servetta like Columbine.
So they had every archetype covered.
Every archetype covered by a highly skilled specialist.
And they must have been traveling extremely heavy, right? Hauling all their own gear.
They were basically self-contained theaters on reels. The companies didn't just have actors. They had carpenters, prop masters, servants, nurses. They moved in these huge carts loaded with costumes, backdrops, machinery, and props.
Including the slapstick itself.
Including the famous batocchio, or slapstick, which gives its name to the whole genre of comedy. This self-sufficiency meant they could set up in any town square or hall and be ready to perform almost immediately.
And it was this nomadic nature that earned them that derogatory term, vagabondy.
Yes. And even today, vagabondy means vagrants or wanderers. It was applied to the Commedia because they were always on the move. And crucially, their movement wasn't always voluntary. It was often forced by that very persecution we just talked about.
Right, from the church or local authorities.
Exactly. Or even from rival theater groups who wanted their audience.
And beyond just being nomads, the content itself was the other major reason for persecution. The comedy was, well, it was shockingly crude.
It was absolutely scandalous, totally unsuited for polite society, which of course is why the public loved it. The storylines frequently got into these crude situations with overt sexuality. They used the masks to obscure the identity of characters committing indecent acts.
And we have documentation that actors would strip.
We do. Both male and female actors were known to strip nearly naked during performances, often to make a point about poverty or desire.
Okay, that detail about stripping suddenly makes the church's reaction feel a little less exaggerated.
It definitely provides some context for the moral panic. Yeah. I mean, the French Parliament in the 17th century went so far as to formally accuse the commissaires of teaching nothing but lewdness and adultery. This combination of independence, nomadism, and explicit content just meant they were constantly on the run.
So how on earth did they survive? If they were constantly being banned, how did they maintain this successful entrepreneurial business model?
Their survival was tied directly to their business strategy, which was dictated by their nomadism. They moved constantly, preferring not to stay too long in one place, driven by a real business fear that their act would get stale.
So that's a calculated move. Maintain scarcity, maintain demand. It's like early celebrity marketing.
Precisely. They made sure to leave while their popularity was still at its peak. This guaranteed two things. First, the locals would be genuinely sad to see them leave, and second, the chance of getting an invitation and payment for a return trip was much higher.
Smart.
And they strategically targeted wealthier towns and public fairs where they were more likely to be successful. They even learned to cultivate high-ranking patrons, dupes, princes, who could give them temporary protection from the authorities. That's how they operated successfully across Europe for centuries, despite all the official opposition.
Okay, let's shift focus to the art form itself, the structure that made them so successful. The power of Commedia lies in its four fixed character groups. And these weren't just funny characters, they were detailed social and regional commentary.
That specificity is so important. According to 18th century critics, each character was originally a characteristic representative of some particular Italian district or town.
Meaning they spoke in a specific dialect.
Exactly. The character was performed in the specific regional dialect of the area they represented. That was an immediate identification tag. When you were watching Pantalone, you weren't just seeing a greedy man, you were hearing the sharp, mercantile dialect of Venice.
And that stinginess was tied directly to the rising capitalism of the Venetian Republic.
That's it. The four groups, the Mashir, they codified these social types perfectly.
So let's start with the old masters.
These are the vecchi, the wealthy but often foolish old men. The two central figures are Pantalone, the greedy Venetian merchant, and Il Guttore, the doctor.
Who's usually from Bologna.
Always from Bologna, home of the oldest university. The dottore is the verbose, pseudo-intellectual know-it-all, always speaking corrupted Latin. All sound, no substance.
And next, the real engine of the comedy. The servants.
The zanni. The servants are clowns, usually from the lower classes or provinces. This group has the global superstars. Arlecchino or Harlequin.
The servant to two masters.
Often, yeah. Clever but childlike. Then Pulcinella, the Neapolitan figure. Brighella, who's the clever, sometimes vicious master of schemes. And Pedrolino, a sort of melancholic precursor to Pierrot. They're the ones who concoct the schemes and make sure the plot actually moves forward.
And the zanni often existed in a hierarchy, right? A clever one and a foolish one.
Absolutely. Brighella or Scapino, they were often the zanni primo, the clever, resourceful plotter. Harlequin evolved into the zanni secondo, the acrobatic, hungry, and easily distracted servant. This duality was essential for the structure of the scenario. It allowed for both intelligent manipulation and physical slapstick to happen at the same time.
And their schemes existed solely to help out the third group, the young lovers.
The innamorati. These are your young upper-class characters like Flavio and Isabella. Their only purpose is to be hopelessly in love and try to get around the obstacles, usually Pantalone or the dottore in their way.
And crucially, they were the only ones who performed unmasked.
Unmasked, and they wore the high fashion of the day.
Why the exception? Why reject the mask, which was the identity marker for everyone else?
Well, the masked characters represented eternal, unchanging social commentary. The greedy merchant is always greedy. The lovers, though, they represented aspirational reality, idealized human beauty. They were meant to be relatable, idealized versions of the wealthy youth in the audience. By keeping them unmasked and in current fashion, they bridged the gap between the chaotic world of the masks and the sophisticated reality of the court.
And finally, the fourth group, the military embarrassment.
That's Il Capitano, the captain. He is the military braggart, usually penniless loner, who boasts endlessly about his bravery and conquests, all of which are completely fictional.
Like Scaramouche.
Scaramuccia, or Scaramouche, is a famous example. He's designed to look impressive but be an utter coward. He's a satire of the mercenary soldiers who were common all over Italy at the time. And since we're talking about improvisation, we have to understand the scaffolding that stopped the whole thing from just falling apart.
The scenario.
Exactly, the scenario.
The rock-solid foundation. It was just an outline, right? The key plot points, character entrances, and exits, but all the dialogue and action was up to the actors.
That's it. Flaminio Scala published 50 of these scenarios around the start of the 17th century, so we have a clear view into the structure. And these scenarios were built around the symmetry of character duets. Two zanni, two vecchi, two pairs of innamorati.
So a scenario like the tooth puller would just outline a rough plot.
Yeah. Pantalone hires the doctor to pull a tooth. Harlequin and Brighella complicate things. The lovers sneak away while the masters are distracted. It provided the spine, ensuring the story moved from A to B, but the actors filled in all the funny stuff.
And that brings us to the most famous tool of the improv actor.
Wow.
The lazzo.
The lasso routine was the actor's lifeblood. A lasso is a stock physical gag, a joke, a piece of pre-planned business that was well known to the performers and often the audience.
So just calling it a stock gag seems a bit simple. What are some concrete examples?
There are hundreds, all categorized. You had the fly lazzo, where a Zanny tries to catch an imaginary fly, escalating the slapstick until he collapses, usually distracting the masters long enough for the lovers to have a secret conversation.
Okay.
Then there was the lazo of the tightrope walk, where a character would physically mime walking a tightrope across the stage, creating tension with just their body movements, even while speaking crucial dialogue.
And given the Zanny's typical state, there must have been a food lotso.
Oh, the food lasso was essential. This was Harlequin or Pulcinella constantly trying to steal food, eating it incredibly quickly, hiding it, accidentally dropping it on his master. It was funny, but it also reinforced Harlequin's defining trait: hunger. Mastering Lossy Men, an actor, had hundreds of these routines ready to go.
This really sounds like the ultimate performer's art form. The plot was totally secondary to the charisma and skill of the actor.
That's exactly why it was so successful. Audiences came to see the performers, not the play. The fame of these individual actors was immense. We mentioned the Innamorata Isabella Andreini. She was so renowned, there's a medallion dedicated to her that reads, "Eternal Fame."
And the first great Harlequin.
Tristano Martinelli achieved international fame. His physical genius and his ability to deploy Lazzi just made him a superstar.
And this whole structure allowed them to weave in immediate political and social satire, keeping the show fresh.
Yes, the performances were easily changed to satirize local scandals, using current events and local news of the day. And because they wore masks and were vagabondy, they had a certain license to criticize local authorities in a way that unmasked local actors would never dare to. The mask gave them protection, and the improvisation gave them timely relevance.
The visual identity of Commedia is inseparable from its influence. Harlequin's costume, in particular, is one of the most famous outfits in history, and it really transformed over time.
It did. And Harlequin's evolution tells a story of, well, social mobility, or at least theatrical formalization. He started off very humbly. His earliest known costume was a long, tight-fitting jacket and trousers, covered in all these oddly shaped patches.
So the patches signified that he was poor.
Exactly. They marked him as a poor, patched-up peasant servant. But the costume evolved from those utilitarian patches to these sophisticated geometry we recognize today.
What drove that shift?
A shift toward standardization and, honestly, court approval. In the 17th century, the patches started turning into blue, red, and green symmetrical triangles, a bit more aesthetic. By the 18th century, you get the iconic look. The uniform, diamond-shaped lozenges. His jacket also got shorter, which made his acrobatics easier, and his soft cap became the familiar double-pointed hat.
So the visual shift mirrors a commercial shift, from a poor peasant to a standardized, recognizable commodity.
That's it, exactly. And the clothing of the masters was just satire and cloth. Take Il Dottore. His entire costume was a direct mockery of academic dress, specifically Bolognese scholars. He was clothed almost entirely in black.
And the huge black hat just amplified the critique of pompous academia.
It did. An actor named Augustin Lolli, in 1653, cemented this look by adding an enormous black hat and a flat neck ruff. It just ensured the Dottore looked utterly ridiculous.
And Pantalone's look is just as specific.
Unmistakable. He's known for his dark capes and his bright red trousers, often with a big black coat called a zamarra. His long, pointed nose mask, the beak, visually reinforces his stinginess.
And Il Capitano.
Il Capitano had the most adaptable costume. It was designed to satirize military wear, so it would change depending on the time and place, often with exaggerated epaulettes or oversized swords to symbolize his lack of real courage.
And we should just remind everyone of the strategic exception.
The Innamorati, the young lovers. They deliberately rejected the fixed, satirical costume and the mask. They wore the highest, most expensive fashion of the day, acting as unmasked anchors of beauty and contemporary style. But they were often heavily made up, so they still had a stylized, non-realistic look, contrasting their smooth faces with the exaggerated masks of the others.
The structures codified by Commedia Dell'arte were so effective that they didn't just fade away. They became the operating system for all the Western theater that followed. You see it most directly in French theater.
Oh, the link with Molière is immense and direct. Molière's company literally shared a stage with the Commedia Italienne in Paris. They were learning from each other. Molière derived forms like the tirade, that long, sustained speech, directly from the rhetorical skills of the masked actors.
And Molière's plays openly used commedia plots and masks.
Absolutely. Just think of Les Fourberies de Scapin. Scapin is an explicit French version of the Zanny archetype, the cunning servant whose whole job is to manipulate the masters for the lovers. Molière's genius was adapting that improvised structure into a tightly scripted French play.
Moving over to England, the connections to Shakespeare, while maybe less direct, are just as compelling.
Oh, they're there. The source material details clear lines of influence. Shakespeare's late romance, The Tempest, for instance, is drawn from a popular scenario in the Flaminio Scala collection, so the plots were clearly being circulated and adapted globally.
And the characters.
The characters, definitely.
Yeah.
The lengthy, self-important buffoon Polonius in Hamlet owes his existence directly to the Pantalone archetype, the meddling, foolish old master.
And of course, Shakespeare's clowns are indebted to the physicality of the zany.
Completely. The lineage of the English stage clown, from Shakespeare all the way through to later pantomime, owes a clear homage to the acrobatic, hungry, and often philosophical Zanni. And even later in Italy, the structure proved too resilient to die. You had Carlo Goldoni trying to formalize it with plays like The Servant of Two Masters.
Which is basically a scripted commedia performance.
Exactly.
And the influence didn't stop at spoken drama. It permeated the world of music. It was foundational for opera buffa.
Commedia masks and plots provided the essential template for Italian comic opera. When composers like Rossini or Verdi needed stock characters for lighthearted plots, they didn't invent them. They just borrowed the commedia types.
You see it so obviously in Mozart's comic masterpieces.
Without a doubt. Think about the comic servants. Figaro in The Marriage of Figaro and Leporello in Don Giovanni. Their quick wit, their resourcefulness, their ability to outsmart their masters. They're direct descendants of the clever Zanni.
And the female characters show the same lineage, going back to roles like Columbine.
The soubrette characters in opera, the quick-witted, often manipulative young women, are the direct heirs of the servetta. Characters like Susanna in Figaro or Zerlina in Don Giovanni, they have that same gossipy, gaiety, and sharp intelligence, using their wit to control the men around them.
And beyond opera, the influence extends into classical music and ballet. Stravinsky, for instance.
He did. Igor Stravinsky's neoclassical period had works that directly referenced the tradition. His ballet Pulcinella from 1920 and Petrushka are both based on the character archetypes.
And on the piano, Robert Schumann's Carnival is probably the most explicit musical homage.
Oh, Carnival is a remarkable piece of work. The entire piece is conceived as a masked ball where Schumann explicitly combines commedia characters, Pierrot, Harlequin, Pantalone, Columbine, with real-world figures. Each musical section is a snapshot of that character's personality. It just shows how deeply embedded these characters were in the European artistic imagination by the 19th century.
The visual arts also codified commedia into a specific genre of painting.
That began with the Flemish Pittori Vago, the wandering painters, who moved into Italian workshops in the 17th century. They established Commedia Dell'arte as a distinct genre, painting scenes from the scenarios.
And what about major figures in later art history? We have to mention Picasso.
Picasso was obsessed with the commedia figures, especially Harlequin. His monumental 1921 painting Three Musicians is a colorful cubist take on commedia-inspired characters. And when Stravinsky was composing Pulcinella, it was Picasso who designed the original costumes and sets.
So after centuries of dominance, how did this traveling theater finally evolve into the forms we recognize today?
As the improvised style declined in popularity, it was being constrained by literary efforts and increasing political suppression, the form fractured. It led directly into 18th century pantomime, especially through Harlequin, who became central to the English pantomime tradition. The focus shifted to pure physical comedy and spectacle.
Retaining the mask, but losing the improvisation.
Exactly. And the Neapolitan Pulcinella had his final, enduring transformation.
Into Punch and Judy.
Yes, into the enduring popularity of the Punch and Judy puppet shows in England. It's just astonishing that this Neapolitan servant, through centuries of mutation, became the aggressive, anarchic, and still immensely popular puppet we know as Punch.
And if we look at modern comedy, do those techniques, the Lazzi, still get passed down?
They absolutely do,
Yeah.
often through the specialized field of clowning. Our sources note the connection to the modern comedian Sacha Baron Cohen G. Borat. He was trained by the French master clown Philippe Gaulier, whose lineage traces directly back through the classical clowning traditions that preserve commedia techniques. So the mastery of the lazzo and the ability to spontaneously adapt a fixed persona are still core skills today.
And that connection to modern satire brings us to the political coda, why the mask was ultimately banned by an emperor.
The political power of the mask was undeniable. During the late 18th century, with all the political instability in Italy, critics of the invading French imperial rule began to use the carnival masks, and by extension the commedia masks, to hide their identities.
So the physical mask provided political courage. It enabled free speech against an occupying force.
That's it. And Napoleon recognized this threat. He saw the improvised style of Commedia and Carnival as a partisan platform challenging his social rule. So, in a deliberate effort to destroy this source of unidentifiable criticism, Napoleon outlawed the Commedia Dell'arte in 1797.
Wow.
The political suppression was incredibly effective. The tradition was essentially killed off in its birthplace, only to be symbolically reborn in Venice in 1979. It just shows the true revolutionary power of the mask.
What a remarkable journey. I mean, from the crude farces of ancient Rome and the chaotic energy of the Venetian carnival, Commedia dell'arte established this fiercely professional, entrepreneurial, and often scandalous tradition.
And it successfully codified the core human condition into four memorable global types: the master, the servant, the lover, and the braggart. It really proved that sometimes, exaggerated archetypes communicate universal truths and satirical commentary far better than high realism ever could.
And as we discussed in that final segment, the mask provided a powerful license for political satire, allowing the masked harlequin to comment freely on contemporary events and challenge empires like Napoleon's.
Which really raises a critical question for you, the listener. If that physical half mask allowed those 16th century actors to hide their identity while challenging the most powerful authorities of their age, what digital masks or online personas exist today?
Anonymous accounts, avatars, fictional personas.
Right. What masks allow our modern comedians, critics, and activists to similarly hide their identities while challenging powerful institutions?
The old master Pantalone and the clever servant Zanny are still performing. Look closely at the figures dominating today's current events, both online and off, and you will find those ancient characters alive and well, just wearing a different kind of mask.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take really comprehensive, sometimes pretty dense source material on one specific topic. It could be science, history, whatever, and we boil it down. We get you that essential, nuanced understanding you need to be, well, truly informed.
And today, our focus is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's a neurodevelopmental condition, incredibly common, actually, but also profoundly misunderstood, I think.
Okay.
Even with decades of clinical agreement, public perception often gets stuck on, stereotypes, just kids who can't sit still.
Exactly. And that's why we do this. We've gathered a lot of research here covering the deep genetic stuff, the brain's unique wiring, the complex impacts across a whole lifetime. We're aiming to take you straight to the core of it.
Yeah, our goal is to show that ADHD is fundamentally about, well, excessive and pervasive symptoms, things like inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and it's all rooted in this key difficulty: executive dysfunction. Think of executive function as the brain's air traffic controller. And in ADHD, well, let's just say that controllers may be taking an unscheduled break, often.
Right. So for you, the learner, listening in, and we're going to get into that weird paradox of hyperfocus, look at why ADHD messes with standard IQ tests sometimes, uncover that huge 70 to 80% genetic link, and discuss some pretty sobering data near the end about quality of life and even life expectancy. Let's dive in and really unpack this.
Okay, so when we talk about ADHD formally, clinically, we have to look at the diagnostic manuals. The main ones are the DSM-5-TR, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases. They lay out the criteria.
And the core idea is that symptoms are just fleeting, right? They have to be excessive, pervasive, last for at least 6 months.
That's right, 6 months minimum. And crucially, they need to significantly interfere with or reduce someone's functioning, and not just in one place.
Ah, yes. The multi-environment rule. It can't just be trouble at school. It has to affect, say, school and home life, or work and social interaction.
Precisely. Pervasiveness is absolutely key for a clinical diagnosis. It shows it's not just a reaction to one specific stressful environment.
Okay. And the DSM-5 also has that age of onset thing, symptoms present before age 12. Why is that important, but also maybe a bit debated?
Well, the idea behind it is to establish that it's truly neurodevelopmental, starting early in brain development, and not something acquired later due to, say, a recent trauma or extreme stress. It points to an underlying difference in brain wiring.
But you said debated.
Hmm.
The research suggests maybe clinicians shouldn't be too rigid about that age 12 cutoff, especially for adults.
Yeah, there's nuance there. It acknowledges that some people, maybe particularly bright individuals or those in really structured, supportive environments, can develop pretty sophisticated coping mechanisms early on.
Ah, so they mask the symptoms.
Effectively, yes. These strategies might work fine until the demands really ramp up in adulthood, managing a job, family, finances all at once. Suddenly, those coping mechanisms get overwhelmed. The underlying symptoms were probably there before 12, but the impairment didn't become obvious or maybe even problematic until much later.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so based on the clusters of symptoms, the sources talk about three main presentations, like different flavors of ADHD.
Right. First up is the predominantly inattentive presentation. Used to be called ADD sometimes, now ADHD-I or PI. This is where the main struggle is with things like organizing tasks, staying focused, following instructions, keeping track of belongings, losing things.
The classic daydreamer kid, maybe.
Often, yes. Or the adult who gets easily sidetracked, maybe tunes out during meetings, or gets lost in their own thoughts constantly. That internal distraction can be really significant for adults.
And this is the one sometimes missed, right? Especially in girls, because it doesn't have that obvious disruptive hyperactivity.
Exactly. Which leads us to the second type. The predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation, ADHD-HI or PH. This is the more classic image many people have.
Okay, what does that look like?
Constant fidgeting, squirming, difficulty staying seated when expected to. In adults, it might be more of a feeling of restlessness, like they always need to be moving. Also, excessive talking, blurting out answers, trouble waiting their turn, interrupting, just acting without really thinking things through.
That lack of forethought.
Yes, that impulsivity. It's much more visible, often disruptive in a classroom or workplace, so it tends to get noticed earlier.
And the third one?
Is the combined presentation, ADHD-C. This is when someone meets the criteria for both the inattentive cluster and the hyperactive impulsive cluster.
Got it.
And historically, this combined type is the one that's been studied the most. Now, a really important point here is the developmental shift. The idea that people just outgrow ADHD, that's a myth. Our sources are very clear on this.
So the core problem that executive dysfunction doesn't go away?
It persists, but the way the symptoms look can change dramatically as people get older. They morph.
Okay, let's talk about that morphing. How does that visible external stuff change, like the kid running around versus the adult?
So in childhood, you see that obvious gross motor stuff, running, jumping, climbing when it's not appropriate, difficulty sitting still through dinner. You also often see related issues like maybe delays in speech or language, some motor skill challenges, and often really messy handwriting reflecting issues with fine motor control and sustained effort.
But adults aren't usually climbing the furniture in meetings. So where does that energy go?
It goes inward. That overt physical hyperactivity often transforms into this profound sense of inner restlessness. Adults describe it as feeling constantly keyed up, like their mind is always racing and need to be busy doing something. It makes it incredibly hard to just relax or switch off, especially at night.
And what about the impulsivity, cutting in line as a kid versus adult life?
Adult impulsivity has much bigger stakes. It can look like sensation-seeking, maybe driving too fast, risky behaviors. It can be impatience, like road rage, or getting easily frustrated in conversations, quick-tempered reactions in relationships, difficulty stopping yourself from saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, and a big one is financial impulsivity, reckless spending, getting into debt.
So the behavior looks different, but it's still that underlying difficulty hitting the brakes, that executive function failure.
Exactly. The core struggle with inhibitory control remains constant, just manifesting in age-appropriate and often more damaging ways. All right, so we've covered the official diagnostic boxes, but let's get into the stuff that really shapes the day-to-day experience, the nuances. And a huge one that many clinicians feel should be in the manuals is emotional dysregulation.
Right, this comes up so much. Why isn't it a formal symptom cluster in the DSM or ICD if it's so common? Is it just too hard to measure?
That's part of the debate. It's complex, but clinically. Emotional dysregulation or mood lability, big swings in mood, is seen as incredibly pervasive. It probably affects the vast majority of people with ADHD. We're talking about difficulty managing emotional responses.
So like really intense reactions to relatively small things and trouble bouncing back.
Exactly that. getting overwhelmed by frustration or disappointment, and then finding it really hard to shake it off and move on. The emotional volume knob seems stuck on high, and the recovery time is slow.
And you can immediately see how that would impact relationships, can't you? If your emotions are all over the place, maintaining stable connections must be tough.
Absolutely. It's a major factor in the relationship difficulties we see. People with ADHD often struggle with the complexities of social interaction, not just making friends, but keeping them. The research is pretty stark. About half of kids and teens with ADHD face social rejection. That's way higher than their peers.
What causes that rejection, usually, is the impulsivity, blurting things out.
That can be part of it, but it's also often about missing subtle social cues. Sarcasm, shifts in tone, body language. Reading those cues quickly relies on good processing speed and working memory, which can be weak spots. Or during a conversation, just zoning out due to inattention.
Making the other person feel ignored or like you don't care.
Precisely. They might come across as uninterested or maybe unreliable because their focus drifts. It makes navigating the social world really challenging.
Okay, let's shift gears to something fascinating and often misunderstood. Hyperfocus. You hear this term a lot. If ADHD is an attention deficit, how can someone hyperfocus?
It's the perfect illustration that ADHD isn't really a lack of attention, it's a problem with regulating attention. Hyperfocus is the state of really intense, narrow, and prolonged concentration on one specific thing.
Okay, but only on certain things, right? What usually triggers it?
Typically tasks that are highly stimulating or provide immediate feedback and reward. Think video games, coding, deep diving into an internet research rabbit hole on a topic they love, maybe intense online chats, or getting lost in a creative project.
Because the task itself is inherently rewarding. The brain doesn't need to work so hard to stay engaged.
Exactly. The dopamine system is already fired up by the activity itself, so the brain doesn't need to rely as much on its internal, often weaker executive control systems to maintain focus.
That actually sounds like a superpower sometimes. Where's the downside if it's listed as a symptom?
The downside is the lack of control over it. While, yes, it might let someone power through a specific interesting project, clinically, hyperfocus is linked to this concept called perseveration.
Perseveration. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Perseveration is basically getting stuck. It's the inability to disengage from something, to shift your attention away even when you need to. Imagine you're watching a really absorbing movie, but the fire alarm goes off. Perseveration is struggling to pull yourself away from the movie to react to the alarm.
So you're locked in, even when it's detrimental.
Yes. That prolonged, excessive attention means neglecting other important things. Forgetting to eat, missing appointments, ignoring people trying to talk to you. And it can link to more serious risks like internet or gaming addiction, or even getting locked into risky behaviors because the ability to stop and switch gears is impaired.
Wow. That really highlights it's about regulating attention, not just having less of it. Okay, let's move to cognition, another tricky area. ADHD and IQ scores.
Right. This needs careful handling. On average, studies do find that groups of people with ADHD score lower. The figure often cited is around 9 points lower on standard IQ tests, but that headline number is really misleading if you don't look deeper.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Does that 9-point difference actually mean people with ADHD are inherently less intelligent? Or is something else going on? Is the test itself maybe not capturing their real abilities?
It's much more the latter. The issue isn't typically overall intellectual capacity. The problem is that the full-scale IQ score, the main number people look at, relies on averaging results from various subtests, and it assumes these subtests are all strongly related, reflecting some general intelligence factor.
But in ADHD, some specific subtests get hit harder than others.
Exactly. The scores tend to drop significantly on subtests that heavily measure working memory and processing speed.
Okay, define those quickly. Working memory is like?
Your mental blackboard. Holding information in mind and manipulating it like doing math in your head or remembering multi-step instructions.
And processing speed.
How quickly and efficiently you can perform simple, often timed tasks, scanning information, making quick decisions.
So if those specific functions are weaker due to the executive dysfunction of ADHD, they drag the overall average score down, even if other areas like verbal reasoning or spatial skills are strong.
Precisely. The test ends up measuring, in part, the impact of the executive function weaknesses on test performance, not just pure intellectual potential. Think of it like having a really fast computer processor, intelligence, but the operating system, executive function, has limited RAM, working memory, and runs kind of sluggishly processing speed.
Gotcha. The underlying ability might be high, but accessing and demonstrating it efficiently under test conditions is the problem.
Exactly. And that's why newer scoring methods exist for tests like the WAIS and WISC. They allow clinicians to calculate an IQ score that gives less weight to, or even substitutes, those working memory and processing speed subtests. This gives a much clearer picture of the person's underlying cognitive strengths, less clouded by the executive function challenges. It also helps explain how some very bright kids manage to compensate for years their high intelligence finds workarounds for the functional deficits until life gets too complex.
Okay, let's shift from symptoms and how ADHD looks to what's actually causing it. And the sources we reviewed are incredibly clear on this point. ADHD is fundamentally biological. It's highly genetic.
Yeah, the evidence here is just overwhelming. It's one of the most robust findings in all of psychiatric genetics. ADHD has a heritability rate estimated between 70 and 80%.
70 to 80%. Can you put that number in context for us? How does that compare to other conditions?
It's extremely high. It's up there with things like height or other major psychiatric conditions like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. It means genetics are far and away the biggest contributing factor.
And when we say genetic, it's not like there's one single ADHD gene, right? It's more complicated.
That's right. It's polygenic. That means it arises from the combined small effects of many different genes, hundreds, potentially thousands accumulating. Many of these genes seem to be involved in brain development or how neurotransmitters, those chemical messengers in the brain, are produced, transported, and received.
Which explains why it runs so strongly in families.
Absolutely. If you have a child with ADHD, their siblings are about 3 to 4 times more likely to also have the disorder compared to the general population. The genetic loading is significant.
Okay, let's use this moment to really hammer home a point and bust some persistent myths. If genetics account for 70–80%, what about the other 20–30%? Because you still hear things about bad parenting or sugar.
Right, and the research is definitive here. That remaining variance is primarily down to non-shared environmental factors, things that happen uniquely to one individual. This could be random, spontaneous genetic mutations, de novo mutations, or significant disruptions very early in brain development. Things like prenatal exposures or birth complications. What it is not significantly driven by, according to solid research, are factors like bad parenting, family stress, poverty, or eating too much sugar.
So those things might make symptoms worse or harder to manage, but they don't cause the underlying condition.
Exactly. That distinction is vital. Stressful environments can absolutely exacerbate ADHD symptoms, but they aren't the root cause. The root cause is biological.
Okay, so sticking with biology, what are those non-genetic environmental risk factors that do play a role, usually very early on?
Yes, the timing is key. These factors impact brain development either before birth or very shortly after. One major one is traumatic brain injury, TBI. It's thought to account for maybe 5% of ADHD cases overall. And the link goes both ways. Kids who have a TBI are at much higher risk, maybe 30% or more, of developing ADHD afterwards.
Wow, 30% after a TBI. That's huge. What else?
Being born extremely prematurely or with a very low birth weight are also significant risk factors. This points towards disruptions in the final, critical stages of brain maturation. And then there's prenatal exposure to certain substances. Alcohol and nicotine are major ones. Exposure to environmental toxins like lead or PCBs during pregnancy can also increase the risk. Essentially anything that interferes with the intricate process of early brain development.
Okay, let's look inside the brain now. What's going wrong at the core level? The pathophysiology. You mentioned neurotransmitters.
Yes. The core issue in ADHD seems to involve functional impairments in key neurotransmitter systems, especially dopamine and norepinephrine. These chemicals are crucial for regulating executive functions.
Dopamine. People often link that just with pleasure, but it's more complex here.
Much more complex. Dopamine is critical for motivation, for determining what's important enough to pay attention to, salience, and for reinforcing behaviors. Norepinephrine is more involved in alertness, vigilance, and responding to novelty. Think of them less as simple messengers and more as modulators. They fine-tune brain activity, especially in the prefrontal cortex.
And in ADHD, these systems are underactive, out of balance.
Functionally impaired is the term often used. The signals aren't being modulated correctly. This leads to problems sustaining attention, especially on boring tasks, controlling impulses, staying organized, and regulating alertness levels. It's like the brain's signal-to-noise ratio is off.
And do we see Physical differences in the brain structure itself?
Yes, consistently. Neuroimaging studies show, on average, subtle but significant differences. There tends to be a general reduction in volume in certain brain areas, particularly in the left prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex, that's the brain's CEO, right?
Yeah.
Planning, decision-making.
Exactly, the highest level of cognitive control. We also see differences in areas like the posterior parietal cortex, which is involved in attention and spatial awareness, and sometimes in the basal ganglia, which relate to reward and habit formation. It's not one single spot, but key networks involved in executive control appear to develop differently or be slightly smaller, particularly during childhood and adolescence. Less volume and potentially altered connectivity in these networks means that air traffic controller we mentioned just doesn't have the resources or connections to manage everything smoothly.
And understanding this chemical imbalance directly explains why stimulant medications work, even though it sounds counterintuitive for hyperactivity.
Precisely. It seems paradoxical, but stimulants like methylphenidate, Ritalin, Concerta, or amphetamines, Adderall, Vivance, work directly on those dopamine and norepinephrine systems. They increase the levels of these neurotransmitters in the synapses, the gaps between nerve cells.
So they're boosting the signal.
Essentially, yes. They enhance the communication within those crucial brain circuits, particularly the pathways connecting the midbrain to the prefrontal cortex, the mesocorticolimbic pathway, and the locus coeruleus system for norepinephrine. By improving the neurochemical environment, they help the prefrontal cortex do its job better, improving focus, reducing impulsivity, enhancing working memory. They help normalize brain function.
Okay, one last biological point from the sources, this paradoxical reaction thing. What's that about?
Ah, yes. That's a really interesting clinical observation. About 10 to 20% of people with ADHD report having unexpected, often opposite reactions to certain psychoactive substances.
Opposite reactions, like what?
Well, for example, a local anesthetic at the dentist might make them feel agitated or wired instead of numb, or a sedative, like some antihistamines, might make them hyper instead of sleepy. Conversely, some find that caffeine, which is a stimulant for most people, actually has a calming or focusing effect on them.
So that their brain chemistry just processes these things differently.
It seems so. It's considered another potential sign of that altered signal processing, likely tied back to the underlying genetic differences affecting neurotransmitter systems. It's consistent enough that some clinicians might actually ask about family history of odd reactions to medications or caffeine as part of their assessment. It can be another small clue pointing towards this neurobiological profile. Okay, so we know ADHD is biological, but diagnosing it isn't straightforward. It relies on observing behavior and assessing development, not on, say, a blood test or a simple scan. And that opens it up to criticism, right? Questions about subjectivity.
True. But the counterargument, like from that international consensus statement you mentioned, is pretty strong. They point out that trained professionals do agree on the criteria, and crucially, the diagnosis actually predicts things really well, future risks, outcomes, even how someone will respond to treatment. It has validity in that sense.
Absolutely. The process itself, when done properly, is thorough. It involves gathering information from multiple sources, parents, teachers, the person themselves, if they're old enough, often using standardized rating scales. Things like the Connor scales, the Vanderbilt, the ACEBA.
But here's a catch you highlighted from the sources. Those rating scales, while internally consistent, the agreement between different raters isn't always great.
Yeah, that's a key challenge. The reliability between raters like a parent and a teacher rating the same child is often only poor to moderate.
Why is that? People just see things differently.
Partly. But it also reflects that behavior is context dependent. A child might hold it together in the structured school environment, but fall apart at home where demands are different. Or vice versa. One environment might trigger hyperactivity, another might trigger inattention more.
So you absolutely need information from multiple settings to get the full picture.
Definitely. Relying on just one perspective gives you an incomplete, potentially biased view. Triangulating information from home, school, and self-report for older individuals is essential.
And speaking of bias, we have to address the systemic issues. The sources pointed out potential racial and socioeconomic biases affecting diagnosis rates.
Yes, this is a significant concern, particularly highlighted in U.S. data. Studies show non-white children are often less likely to be diagnosed with ADHD or receive treatment, even when they show similar levels of symptoms to white children.
Why does that happen? Access to care.
That's a big part of it, disparities in access to specialists. But it could also involve implicit biases in how behaviors are interpreted. For example, a teacher might view disruptive behavior in a black child as a discipline issue, while similar behavior in a white child is seen as potentially ADHD related and warrants a referral. Cultural differences in how symptoms are described or perceived by families can also play a role. It's a complex problem where the biological reality meets societal inequities.
Okay, moving past diagnosis challenges, let's talk about telling ADHD apart from other things. Differential diagnosis. Because lots of conditions can look similar on the surface, right?
Absolutely crucial. Symptoms like trouble concentrating, irritability, restlessness, they overlap with many other conditions. Bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, PTSD, major depression, even learning disabilities or autism. Clinicians have to carefully rule these out.
How do they tease it apart? What's the key difference?
It often comes down to the reason behind the symptom and the overall pattern. Take forgetfulness, for example.
Down.
In ADHD, forgetfulness is often due to poor working memory or failure to encode the information in the first place because attention wandered, a lack of persistence. In anxiety or depression, forgetfulness might stem more from rumination. The mind is so preoccupied with worries or negative thoughts that it just blanks on other things. The behavior looks similar, but the underlying mechanism is different.
Or like fidgeting.
Right. Fidgeting in ADHD is often about self-regulation, trying to increase alertness or manage restlessness. That's different from the involuntary motor tics you see in Tourette syndrome, or the repetitive, often self-soothing movements, stereotypies, common in autism spectrum disorder. You need a skilled clinician to look at the whole picture.
But even when they do diagnose ADHD accurately, it rarely travels alone, does it? The comorbidity rates are incredibly high.
They really are. It's more the norm than the exception. For kids, something like 2/3 have at least one other co-occurring condition.
2/3. Wow. What are the most common overlaps?
Big overlap with other neurodevelopmental conditions. Around 21% also meet criteria for autism spectrum disorder. And specific learning disabilities, dyslexia, dyscalculia, are found in maybe 20 to 30% of kids with ADHD. Importantly, ADHD itself isn't a learning disability, but they frequently co-occur.
And what about behavioral or mood disorders?
Very common too. Oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD, that pattern of arguing, defying rules, blaming others, occurs in maybe 25 to 50%. Conduct disorder, CD, which is more severe, involving aggression or law breaking, is seen in about 25%, especially with the combined ADHD presentation.
That seems linked to the impulsivity and emotional dysregulation we talked about.
Almost certainly. And then you have high rates of major depressive disorder and various anxiety disorders co-occurring as well. Living with the constant struggles of ADHD can understandably contribute to mood problems.
We also need to touch on the link with trauma adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and PTSD. That relationship seems really complex.
It's very complex and likely bidirectional. On one side, experiencing severe trauma, especially early in life, can disrupt brain development and lead to symptoms that look a lot like ADHD attention problems, hypervigilance, impulsivity. Trauma is a risk factor.
And the other direction.
The core features of ADHD impulsivity, poor risk assessment, difficulty regulating emotions, can actually increase a person's likelihood of experiencing traumatic events. Things like accidents, injuries, maybe getting into dangerous situations, or having volatile relationships. It can become a really difficult cycle.
Okay, let's talk about a very modern comorbidity. Problematic digital media use, or PDMU. Internet addiction, gaming issues. How does ADHD fit in? That hyperfocus seems relevant again.
Hugely relevant. PDMU is strongly linked with ADHD. And again, it looks bidirectional. The ADHD brain, with its potential for hyperfocus and its craving for novelty and immediate reward, finds the digital world incredibly compelling. Games, social media feeds, they offer constant, instant gratification, which is very appealing when your internal dopamine system is maybe running a bit low.
So ADHD makes you more vulnerable to getting hooked.
Yes, the impulsivity and the pull of hyperfocus make it harder to disengage. But there's evidence for the other direction, too. Excessive, constant digital stimulation might actually worsen ADHD symptoms over time.
How so?
By training the brain to expect constant novelty and instant feedback, it can potentially further weaken the ability to sustain focus on tasks that require patience and delayed gratification, like reading a book or doing homework. It might functionally impair the executive control system even more.
Okay, one last point in this section. Rejection-sensitive dysphoria, RSD. It's not an official diagnosis, but it resonates hugely with the ADHD community.
It really does. RSD describes this experience of intense, almost unbearable emotional pain triggered by the perception, real or imagined, of being rejected, criticized, teased, or letting someone down.
Perception being the key word there.
Yes, it might not be actual rejection, but the fear or interpretation of it causes this extreme reaction, intense sadness, shame, anger, or anxiety. While it's an informal term, clinicians estimate it affects a large majority of people with ADHD. It likely stems from that combination of emotional dysregulation and potentially a history of actual social difficulties or feeling like you're always messing up. It creates this profound sensitivity to perceived disapproval.
All right, we've covered the what, the why, the complexities. Now let's talk about management. Given everything we've discussed, what's the recommended approach according to the research?
The gold standard is generally a multimodal approach. That means combining different strategies, usually counseling or therapy, behavioral strategies, and often medication. And it's really important to state this clearly. The scientific consensus is that medication is the single most effective intervention for managing the core symptoms of ADHD.
The inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity.
Exactly. And beyond just symptom relief, medication has been shown to significantly improve long-term outcomes across a range of areas.
Like what kind of outcomes are we talking about?
Things like reducing the risk of accidents and injuries, which makes sense given impulsivity, lowering the rates of developing substance abuse problems later on, reducing involvement with the justice system, and even lowering the risk of suicide. Medication helps stabilize the underlying neurobiology, which then allows the person to better engage with and benefit from other therapies and life skills training.
Okay, let's break down the medications. Stimulants first, methylphenidate, amphetamines. They're usually the first thing tried.
Yes, they are first-line treatments, and they work well for most people. About 70% respond positively to the first stimulant they try. There was some controversy years ago, but a major global scientific consensus statement came out in 2021. It looked at tons of data and unanimously confirmed that methylphenidate, for example, is both safe and highly effective when used appropriately for ADHD. It really settled a lot of the debate based on rigorous evidence.
So safe and effective for the majority. What about the 30% who don't respond well, or people who maybe can't take stimulants due to other issues like a history of substance abuse?
That's where non-stimulant medications come in. Drugs like atomoxetine or viloxazine work differently, mainly on the norepinephrine system. They don't have the same abuse potential, so they can be a good option in those cases. Atomoxetine, in particular, has shown similar effectiveness to methylphenidate for kids and teens, although it might take a bit longer, maybe several weeks, to see the full benefits.
Okay. And there are also those alpha-2A agonists, guanfacine, clonidine.
Right. Those are often used either as alternatives if stimulants and non-stimulants don't work, or sometimes added on to a stimulant. They tend to be less potent for the core attention symptoms compared to stimulants, but they can be particularly helpful for managing things like emotional outbursts, aggression, tics, or sleep problems, which often go along with ADHD.
Makes sense. Now, beyond medication, what are the key non-pharmacological strategies? Therapy, skills training.
Absolutely essential. Behavioral therapies are often recommended as the very first step, especially for younger preschool-aged children or those with milder symptoms. Parent management training, or PMT, is huge here.
What does that involve?
It teaches parents concrete strategies for managing behavior, using positive reinforcement effectively, setting clear expectations, improving communication. For older kids, adolescents, and adults, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, can be very helpful.
How does CBT help with ADHD?
It targets specific challenges. It can help with managing emotional regulation, developing better organizational and planning skills, challenging the negative thought patterns that often come with years of struggle, and building coping strategies. Medication helps the brain work better. Therapy teaches you how to use that better working brain more effectively.
And technology is playing a role now too, right? I remember reading about a game-based therapy.
Yes, that's Endeavor AirX, or AKLT01. It's actually FDA authorized as a prescription digital therapeutic. It's basically a specifically designed video game aimed at improving attention and cognitive control.
A prescribed video game. Does it work?
The clinical trials have shown significant improvements in objective measures of attention and inhibitory control in children, and some promising results in adults, too. The idea is that the engaging game mechanics repeatedly target and potentially strengthen those underlying neural networks involved in attention regulation. It's a really interesting development in treatment.
Okay, quickly, what about things people often try but aren't really backed by science as core treatments, like exercise or special diets?
Right. So exercise is fantastic for overall health, mood, and maybe some temporary focus improvement. But major guidelines, like from the American Academy of Pediatrics or NICE in the UK, state clearly that it doesn't reduce the core symptoms of ADHD enough to be considered a standalone treatment. And regarding diet, things like sugar elimination, removing food dyes, or using supplements, the evidence just isn't strong or consistent enough for them to be recommended as standard treatments for most people.
Might help a very small subset with specific sensitivities, maybe?
Possibly. But for the vast majority, broad dietary changes aren't the answer for core ADHD symptoms, according to the current evidence.
Okay, let's turn to the long view. Prognosis. We established it's not something people typically outgrow completely.
No, it's generally a lifelong condition. Estimates vary, but maybe 30 to 50% of kids diagnosed will continue to meet full criteria in adulthood. And even for those who don't meet full criteria, many continue to experience significant symptoms. As we said, the obvious hyperactivity might fade into that inner restlessness, and people develop coping strategies, sure. But the underlying challenges with executive functions, self-management, organization, follow-through, often persist.
And these persistent challenges have real-world consequences. Diminished quality of life, struggles in education and work.
Definitely. Worse academic outcomes, on average, more difficulties holding down jobs or advancing in careers, higher rates of relationship problems, and significantly higher risks for unintentional injuries, car accidents, workplace accidents, things like that.
And the sources also mention a stark statistic about the prison population.
Yes, tragically high rates. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 25 and 26% of people in prison may have ADHD. It really underscores how untreated impulsivity, poor planning, and difficulty regulating behavior can lead down incredibly difficult paths. It's a huge public health issue.
Which brings us to maybe the most sobering finding we encountered. Recent research on life expectancy. This was pretty shocking.
It is. This was newer research published in 2025, according to our sources, and it found a significant reduction in average life expectancy linked to ADHD.
How significant?
The finding was an average reduction of about 7 years for men with ADHD and around 9 years for women with ADHD compared to their peers without the condition.
9 years. That is a massive difference. Why? It's not the ADHD itself that's fatal, presumably.
No, absolutely not. The reduction isn't from the ADHD directly, but from the increased risk of associated health problems and behaviors that often accompany unmanaged or poorly managed ADHD across the lifespan.
Okay, break that down. What are those associated risks driving this?
Well, think about the impulsivity and risk-taking that leads directly to higher rates of those accidental injuries we mentioned, some of which can be fatal. Then there's the difficulty with self-regulation and future planning. This contributes to higher rates of chronic unhealthy habits. Smoking, for instance, is much more common in adults with ADHD, sometimes used almost as self-medication for restlessness or focus issues.
So that core executive function deficit, struggling to make choices that benefit your future self, directly impacts long-term health behaviors.
Exactly. You also see much higher rates of co-occurring conditions that carry their own health risks. Major depression, anxiety disorders, alcohol, and substance misuse. Again, sometimes these are attempts to self-medicate the internal chaos or emotional pain like RSD. When you combine higher rates of accidents, chronic unhealthy habits like smoking or poor diet, and serious mental health comorbidities, sadly, that cumulative burden takes a toll on longevity.
It really drives home that ADHD isn't just about focus in school. It's a serious health condition with potentially life-altering and life-shortening consequences if not properly understood and managed throughout life. #outro.
So, to wrap up our deep dive today, we've seen that ADHD is fundamentally a highly genetic neurodevelopmental disorder. It's rooted in how the brain's executive functions work, particularly involving dopamine and norepinephrine systems, leading to those core issues with attention regulation, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. And it can manifest in surprising ways, like that paradox of hyperfocus.
And for you, the listener, hopefully digging into these nuances, really grasping the genetic basis, understanding why IQ scores can be misleading, seeing the reality of emotional dysregulation, and confronting those serious long-term health risks, including the life expectancy data, gives you a much richer, more accurate picture than the old, simplistic stereotypes.
It's a complex clinical reality, yes, but one that's increasingly understood biologically, has predictable patterns, and importantly, is treatable with the right support.
Which leads us to a final thought to leave you with, something sparked by the evolutionary angle in our sources. We know ADHD traits are highly influenced by genetics, and we also know from genetic studies that natural selection seems to have been working against many of these specific genetic variants for a very long time, for millennia. So if these traits have faced negative selection pressure, why do they persist so commonly in the human population? What does that tension tell us about human evolution and maybe the varied environments we've inhabited? And how should that deep biological history inform the current, often heated debate about whether ADHD is purely a disorder, needing a cure, or if it represents a form of neurodiversity that perhaps requires more accommodation from the environment? Something to ponder. Join us next time for another deep dive.
Welcome to the deep dive. We take complex histories, massive amounts of information, and boil them down into the key conversation you need. Today, it's a big one, the Reformation.
Yeah, huge.
Now, the story most people know, it starts with Martin Luther, right?
Well,
Nailing his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517. It's dramatic.
it is dramatic.
Yep.
And important, absolutely. But thinking of it as just that one moment, well, it kind of misses the bigger picture. It wasn't a lightning strike out of nowhere.
Okay, so it's more complicated.
Much more. But what we call the Reformation was really a whole messy collision of different theological ideas, political power plays, social changes, all happening across Europe in the 16th century.
Plural then, Reformations.
That's how a lot of historians see it now, yeah. You've got Lutheranism taking off, but then there's Calvinism, which is different again, and the radical reformers, the Anabaptists, plus the Catholic Church itself is reforming internally. It's all happening.
Right. So our mission today, for you listening, is to unpack that complexity. We need to understand the deep roots, the stuff that made this whole explosion possible long before Luther.
Exactly. And then look at how it fractured, why it fractured into these different streams, and crucially, how this 16th century upheaval basically shaped the modern world we live in. The consequences were enormous.
It's a vast topic, honestly. The sheer volume of writing on this is staggering. But we've done the sifting. We're giving you the essential insights.
Let's dive in. Where do we start? Maybe with the mood in Europe before 1517.
Yeah, let's set the stage. What was the atmosphere like? Because it feels like it must have been ripe for change. A real powder keg.
That's a good way to put it. You have to remember the psychological backdrop. Europe had been through centuries of, frankly, terrifying calamities. The biggest one, the Black Death.
Wiped out maybe a third of the population.
At least. Imagine the trauma. It leaves this deep-seated, lingering fear of sudden death. You see it everywhere in the art of the time, that dance macabre imagery death, coming for everyone, kings, peasants, everyone.
And that fear translates into anxiety about salvation, right? If you could die at any moment, you'd be desperate to know you're okay, spiritually speaking. Worried about purgatory.
Absolutely central. Purgatory, this idea of a painful waiting room before heaven, it loomed large. Minimizing your time there became a major preoccupation, and this intense spiritual need runs right up against the problems within the church itself.
The institution that should have been providing comfort and answers.
Right, but it was struggling. You had serious structural issues, things like pluralism.
That's holding multiple church jobs at once.
Exactly. A bishop might hold 3 bishoprics, or a priest multiple parishes, which inevitably leads to non-residence. You can't be in 3 places at once.
So you hire deputies.
Often poorly paid, poorly educated deputies. The actual pastoral care, the spiritual guidance people craved, it just wasn't there in many places. Lay people weren't stupid. They saw this. Respect for the hierarchy eroded.
And it wasn't just local priests. The very top, the papacy, had its own scandals.
Oh, absolutely. The Renaissance papacy. Well, it wasn't always focused solely on spiritual matters. Think of Pope Alexander VI, Borgia Pope, openly promoting his illegitimate children.
Or Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, literally leading armies. It doesn't sound very Christ-like.
It wasn't, and people noticed. You start seeing these sharp underground satires, like Julius excluded from heaven, where the Pope gets turned away at the pearly gates. That tells you something about the cynicism among the educated classes, even before Luther.
Okay, so there's fear, there's corruption, there's cynicism, but that deep need for salvation, for dealing with the purgatory anxiety, that was real. The church did offer solutions like indulgences. Weren't they meeting a genuine need, even if imperfectly?
That's the crucial tension. Yes, the church offered mechanisms: confession, penance, good works, pilgrimages, and, yes, indulgences, actions, or donations believed to lessen time in purgatory.
Yeah.
These were tangible. People felt they were doing something.
Which makes Luther's later solution, focusing on internal faith alone, seem almost abstract, maybe, harder to grasp.
Initially, perhaps. But his message resonated partly because the existing system felt increasingly transactional, even corrupt. And then there's the technological game changer that allowed Luther's seemingly abstract idea to spread like wildfire.
The printing press, Gutenberg's invention.
You can't overstate its importance. Suddenly, producing books and pamphlets is faster, cheaper, much cheaper. Sources suggest book prices dropped by maybe 85%.
Wow, that's massive.
It is, and it's not just about cost, it's about access and language. Printers start churning out religious texts, Bible translations, controversial tracts, often in the vernacular in German, French, English, not just Latin.
So ordinary people, not just priests and scholars, could start reading and interpreting for themselves.
Precisely. It empowers the laity. If your local priest is absent or you suspect he doesn't know what he's talking about, now you might have a printed pamphlet, maybe even a Bible passage in your own language, to compare. It fundamentally shifts the power dynamic regarding knowledge.
And we need to remember, Luther wasn't the first to challenge the church or call for reform. There were precursors, right? People who tried and, well, often failed.
Definitely. You had figures like John Wycliffe in England back in the 14th century with the Lollards questioning things like the nature of the Eucharist.
And Jan Hus in Bohemia.
Jan Hus, a century before Luther, he was pushing hard for reforms, criticizing indulgences, demanding the laity receive both bread and wine at communion. He gained a huge following.
But he was executed, burned at the stake at the Council of Constance in 1415.
Right, and his execution sent a chilling message. The institutional church would crush dissent, violently if necessary. But it also showed just how deep the desire for reform already ran. Hus became a martyr, a symbol. So the ground was fertile, you could say, full of tension, need, new technology, just waiting for a spark.
Which brings us to Germany around 1517, and it really does circle back to money, doesn't it? Specifically funding the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome.
It does. Pope Leo X needed enormous sums for this massive, prestigious project. So he authorized a special plenary indulgence, one intended to cover all sins and get you straight into heaven, essentially.
And the sales campaign for this was aggressive.
Very aggressive, especially in Germany. It was overseen by Albert of Brandenburg, who himself was deeply in debt to the Pope for letting him hold multiple high offices, pluralism again.
Ah, the system feeding itself.
Exactly. And Albert hired a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel to preach the indulgence. Tetzel was apparently a very effective, if crude, salesman.
This is where we get that infamous jingle. As soon as the coin into the box rings, a soul from purgatory to heaven springs.
That's the one attributed to him. It horrified many, including Martin Luther. It seemed to reduce salvation to a crass financial transaction, the absolute opposite of spiritual depth.
So this is the immediate trigger for Luther. The 95 Theses were a direct response to Tetzel.
They were. The theses were essentially academic points for debate, challenging the theological validity and the practice of selling indulgences. But crucially, underlying this was Luther's own profound spiritual journey and his big theological breakthrough.
The Tower experience.
Yes, sometime around 1519, maybe a bit earlier. Reflecting on Paul's letter to the Romans, he had this revelation about the righteousness of God. He realized it wasn't primarily about God's punishing justice, but his saving mercy, granted freely to those who have faith.
Justification by faith alone, sola fide.
Sola fide, that's the core. The Catholic Church taught faith plus good works, sacraments, mediated by the Church. Luther came to believe that justification before God comes only through faith in Christ's sacrifice. Good works are important, yes, but they are the result of being saved, not the means to salvation.
That's a fundamental shift. It takes the power away from the institution, from the priests selling indulgences or prescribing penance, and puts the focus on the individual's direct relationship with God through faith.
It's profoundly individualistic, in a way, and potentially liberating for people burdened by the old system. And again, the printing press becomes Luther's amplifier.
He really knew how to use it, didn't he?
Masterfully. He wrote prolifically sermons, pamphlets, commentaries. It's estimated something like a fifth of all works printed in Germany in the early 16th century were by Luther. He wrote in powerful German, not just academic Latin.
And used images, too.
Yes. Collaborations with artists like Lucas Cranach the Elder produced woodcuts. These are like political cartoons, often sharply critical of the Pope and the church hierarchy. explaining Luther's ideas visually for a largely illiterate population. It was a multimedia campaign, essentially.
What's striking, though, is how quickly this protest movement, Luther's movement, starts to splinter. You'd think they'd unite against Rome, but they start disagreeing amongst themselves almost immediately.
That's one of the most fascinating and consequential aspects. The first major split happens pretty early on between Luther and another key reformer, Huldrych Zwingli, in Zurich, Switzerland.
They met, right, try to hash things out.
They did. At the Marburg Colloquy in 1529, Philip of Hesse, a German prince sympathetic to the Reformation, brought them together, hoping they could form a united theological front. They agreed on 14 out of 15 points of doctrine, but the 15th, that was the sticking point.
Eucharist, the Lord's Supper.
Exactly. How is Christ present in communion? Luther, despite breaking with Catholic transubstantiation, still insisted on a real, physical, corporeal presence of Christ in, with, and under the bread and wine. Sacramental union. For him, the words, "This is my body," were literal.
And Zwingli disagreed.
Strongly. Zwingli argued it was primarily a symbolic memorial. Christ is present spiritually, yes, but the bread and wine are signs, reminders of his sacrifice. The key verb for Zwingli was signifies, not is.
Sounds like a subtle theological point, but it clearly mattered deeply to them.
Oh, it was fundamental. For Luther, Zwingli's view emptied the sacrament of its power, made it merely human remembrance. He famously took chalk and wrote, "Hoc est corpus meum," this is my body, on the table, and refused to budge. The meeting broke up in disagreement.
And Luther's parting shot.
Reportedly, something like, "Our spirit has nothing in common with your spirit." It was a definitive break. It established this lasting division between the Lutheran evangelical tradition and the Reformed Zwinglian, later Calvinist tradition within Protestantism. They couldn't even agree on communion.
Wow. And then, alongside these major streams led by Luther and Zwingli, you also have the radical Reformation emerging, the Anabaptists.
Yes, groups like the Swiss Brethren. They felt Luther and Zwingli didn't go far enough. They wanted a complete restoration of what they saw as early pure Christianity, a total break from the state church system.
Anabaptist means rebaptizer, right? Because they rejected infant baptism.
Exactly. They insisted baptism was only valid for adult believers who made a conscious confession of faith. Baptizing infants who couldn't make that choice was meaningless to them. This was incredibly radical because infant baptism was tied to citizenship, social order, the whole fabric of medieval society.
So rejecting it wasn't just a theological stance, it was seen as politically subversive.
Deeply subversive. It implied creating a separate community of believers, distinct from the wider society. They often embraced pacifism, refused to swear oaths, wouldn't hold public office, basically separating themselves from the world.
Which made them targets for persecution by both Catholics and other Protestants.
Tragically, yes.
Yeah.
Rebaptism was often made a capital offense. The story of Felix Manz, one of the early Swiss Anabaptist leaders, being deliberately drowned in Zurich in 1527. It's horrific. Zwingli himself approved it. They were seen as dangerous anarchists, threatening the stability of church and state.
Yet, despite this intense persecution, they developed their own core beliefs and practices.
They did. The Schleitheim Articles of 1527, drawn up by Michael Sattler shortly before his own execution, became a foundational document. It outlined their key tenets: believers' baptism, the Lord's Supper as a memorial for baptized believers only, separation from the world, pacifism, no oath-swearing. It defined Anabaptist identity for centuries.
So you have these theological splits, Lutheran, Reformed, radical, happening almost simultaneously. But how did any of these actually survive and spread? It seems like theology alone wouldn't be enough against entrenched power.
You've hit the nail on the head. Political protection was absolutely critical, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, which was this patchwork of principalities, cities, territories.
Not a unified state like France or England.
Right. So the decision of the local ruler, the prince, the city council, became paramount. If your ruler decided to adopt Lutheranism, it had a chance to take root. If your ruler remained loyal to the emperor and the pope, reform movements were often suppressed. It became highly politicized very quickly.
Is that where the name Protestant actually comes from, a political act?
It is. In 1529, at the Diet of Speyer, the Catholic majority tried to reverse earlier concessions and enforce the condemnation of Luther. A group of Lutheran princes and cities formally issued a protestatio, a legal protest against this decision.
So they were the protesting ones, Protestants.
That's how the name stuck. It originated in a specific political dissent within the empire's legal framework.
And this link between the ruler's faith and the territory's faith gets formalized later.
Yes, after decades of conflict, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 tried to settle things within the empire. It established the principle of cuius regio, ius religio,
Whose realm, their religion.
meaning the ruler of each territory could choose either Catholicism or Lutheranism as the official faith. Calvinism wasn't included yet, that came later. The subjects were expected to follow their ruler's choice, or they were allowed to emigrate.
So it wasn't really about individual religious freedom as we think of it today. It was the ruler's freedom to choose for everyone.
Precisely. It stabilized the situation somewhat, but it enshrined religious division based on political boundaries.
Now, England is a whole different story, isn't it? The English Reformation wasn't initially driven by a theologian like Luther or Zwingli.
No, it was driven from the top down, by the king, Henry VIII. And his primary motivation wasn't theological disagreement with Rome, it was dynastic. He desperately needed a male heir, and his wife, Catherine of Aragon, hadn't provided one. He wanted an annulment.
Which the Pope refused to grant.
Right, largely for political reasons involving Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So Henry took matters into his own hands. The critical step was the 1534 Act of Supremacy,
Declaring the king, not the Pope, the supreme head of the Church of England.
a political and legal break. Initially, the doctrine remained largely Catholic, just without papal authority, but then, especially under his son Edward VI and guided by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, more Protestant theology started to come in.
Cranmer and the Book of Common Prayer. That seems key to shaping the specific identity of Anglicanism.
Immensely important. Cranmer was genuinely influenced by continental Protestant thought, particularly the Reformed tradition. But he sought a via media, a middle way. The Book of Common Prayer blended traditional Catholic liturgical structures and ceremonies with Protestant theology, especially regarding salvation and the Eucharist. It created a unique synthesis.
So while all this fracturing and political maneuvering is happening in the Protestant world, what's the Catholic Church doing? Just watching?
Far from it. There was a powerful internal movement for reform and renewal within Catholicism, often called the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. It involved cleaning up abuses, clarifying doctrine, and finding new ways to inspire loyalty and piety.
And new religious orders were a big part of this, weren't they, like the Jesuits?
The Society of Jesus, founded by Ignatius of Loyola and approved by the Pope in 1540, was arguably the most dynamic force in the Catholic revival. Loyola, a former soldier, brought a sense of discipline and mission.
His spiritual exercises became very influential.
Yes, a message for intense personal spiritual development. The Jesuits focused heavily on education, founding schools and universities, and on global missionary work, taking Catholicism to Asia, the Americas. They were intellectually rigorous, adaptable, and fiercely loyal to the papacy.
They grew incredibly fast, too.
Phenomenally fast. About 1,000 members when Loyola died in 1556, maybe 3,500, just 10 years later. They provided the trained manpower and intellectual firepower the church needed to respond to the Protestant challenge.
And the definitive doctrinal response came from the Council of Trent.
Yes, the Council of Trent was the linchpin of the Catholic Reformation. It met in 3 long sessions between 1545 and 1563. It was the church's official, comprehensive answer to the issues raised by Protestantism.
What were the main outcomes? Did they compromise at all?
On doctrine, absolutely not. Trent reaffirmed core Catholic teachings in direct opposition to Protestant ideas. It declared that justification requires both faith and good works, condemning sola fide. It stated that religious authority rests on Scripture and church tradition, not sola scriptura. It upheld the 7 sacraments, transubstantiation, the importance of the priesthood.
So drawing clear battle lines.
Unmistakably. But it also addressed internal problems. It condemned pluralism and non-residence, mandated better education for priests through seminaries, and tried to standardize liturgical practices. It was about both doctrinal clarity and institutional reform. It shaped modern Catholicism profoundly.
So we have these irreconcilable theological positions backed by political power. It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
And it was for a long time. The period following the initial Reformation splits was marked by brutal religious warfare across Europe.
The French Wars of Religion, the Dutch Revolt against Spain, the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire.
Exactly. Decades, even centuries of conflict where religious allegiance often fueled political and military struggles. Millions died. It was a devastating period, showing just how intertwined faith and power had become.
How did it eventually settle down? Was there a final political resolution?
The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, ending the 30 Years' War, is often seen as the key moment. It essentially recognized the permanent religious divisions in the Holy Roman Empire.
Did it change the cuius regio ius religio principle from Augsburg?
It expanded it. Critically, it formally recognized Calvinism alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism as legitimate options for rulers. It also added provisions guaranteeing limited rights for religious minorities within a territory to practice privately. And importantly, it affirmed the sovereignty of individual states, reducing the influence of both the emperor and the pope in political affairs.
The Pope didn't like that, I imagine.
Pope Innocent X furiously condemned the treaties as null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, and so on. But the European powers largely ignored him. It signaled a major shift, the end of the papacy's ability to dictate political arrangements across Europe. The modern secular state system was beginning to emerge.
Beyond the wars and the politics, what were the long-term, perhaps unexpected consequences of this whole era? Things that still affect us.
Well, literacy is a huge one. Luther's insistence that everyone should read the Bible spurred efforts towards mass education, especially in Protestant regions.
And his German Bible translation itself.
Hugely significant, not just for religion but for language. It played a key role in standardizing modern High German. Similar effects happened with vernacular Bible translations elsewhere. It fostered national languages and identities.
And some have argued connections to economic development, the Protestant work ethic idea.
That's Max Weber's famous, though debated, thesis. The idea that certain aspects of Protestant theology, particularly Calvinism's emphasis on hard work, discipline, and seeing worldly success as a possible sign of divine election, contributed to the rise of capitalism. It's complex, but the Reformation certainly reshaped cultural attitudes towards work, money, and society.
So looking back at this whole tumultuous period, for you, the listener, what's the big takeaway? We started with Luther and a thesis, but it became so much more.
I think the key is seeing how a potent mix of deep-seated spiritual anxiety, institutional decay, political ambition, and a revolutionary new media technology, the printing press, combined to shatter a thousand-year-old religious and cultural consensus.
The printing press really was the internet of its day, wasn't it? Democratizing information, bypassing traditional gatekeepers, allowing radical new ideas to spread and communities to form around them.
Absolutely. It broke the church's near monopoly on the dissemination of religious knowledge and interpretation. And that fracturing had consequences. Nobody at the time could have fully foreseen religious wars, yes, but also the foundations for modern states, modern education, maybe even modern economic systems.
Which leads to a provocative thought to leave you with. The Reformation saw this single ancient source of authority of the church fundamentally challenged and fragmented by a new technology of knowledge dissemination.
So the question for us today is, what contemporary monolithic sources of authority, maybe it's in government or media or finance or science, are currently facing similar disruptive challenges from new technologies or new ways of sharing information? Think about AI, decentralized networks, social media. What established certainties are cracking?
And what unforeseen, perhaps equally revolutionary social, political, or even spiritual structures might emerge from those cracks in the decades to come. Something to ponder.
Definitely something to ponder.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the complex world of the Reformation. We'll see you next time.